Well, welcome everyone to what should be an illuminating and enlightening half an hour as we cover how to successfully navigate workforce data migration, especially when changing providers or systems. I'm Mike Baer. I'm president of Baer Unlimited, and you can see here on this next slide kind of what I've done, what I'm doing now in terms of covering new payroll developments like this one and helping teams avoid exposure and increase performance. And I'm happy to have with me today Gabe Bell, a vice president of ResNav Solutions. And he's going to help us go over the often precarious process of moving important data out of our payroll and HR systems and into a place where it is accessible and secure. It's a lot harder than people think. Gabe, tell us a little bit about your background and ResNav as well.
Great, thanks, Mike. Excited to join you and our attendees today. So Gabe Bell, I'm a vice president of channel sales at ResNav. I've spent all of my career, the last 20 years, in the HCM payroll industry. Primarily, I spent 13 years at ADP, various tech companies. I've always been faced with helping clients navigate transitions from one tech provider to the next, and have learned a lot about pitfalls and common mistakes. And I'm excited to talk more about that with you today.
All right, thanks, Gabe. Well, this next slide, we're going to be talking about what we're covering in today's short session. And it's a lot, actually. So we'll start with how payroll professionals and those in HR are becoming really more than overseers of the employment related data that is collected and that flows through the processes and the systems that and the applications that they're engaged with. Next, we talk about how the transfer of this important data has traditionally been handled, for good or bad. And unfortunately, mostly bad is what we've been seeing out there. Then we cover what the end result really should look like, followed by the big upside of how this material or information can be used first tactically and then strategically by your organization. And then we'll finish with some suggested ways to identify the proper option for your organization. So let's get started. Payroll and HR operations are constantly grappling with managing the data collected and used to perform those two critical functions. It's a huge challenge that's getting bigger as folks are needing to be more strategic with that data. People are realizing that data is super valuable. And so now it's a growing part of the payroll and HR role. But if the data being referred to is not right, well, Gabe, there are some problems that can result. So payroll leaders, you can be dealing with incomplete or faulty data, and that can lead to that bad analysis. If the historical data, that backbone is often fragmented, there's missing pieces. So some of the results from that, what are some of the problems that can result from this data kind of inefficiency?
Yeah, great question, Mike. So, I would say historically, when payroll and HR leaders have thought about historical data, the main concern has been around compliance. There are federal and state record keeping requirements for various records related to employees. And then there's also in specific industries, whether it be nonprofits or education or healthcare, there can be niche requirements around record keeping. And so it's always important to make sure that, obviously you're complying as an organization with the various regulatory agencies, but then you want the ability to report historically that, hey, we did comply with those requirements. Here's the documentation that shows that, et cetera. And it, continues to protect the business. One thing that we've seen though, and I think everyone's talking about AI and data analytics. I was at HR Tech earlier this fall, obviously the hot topic, but organizations, particularly payroll and HR leaders, are asked to be more strategic with their data, and having access to your historical data, records, trend analysis in the business. Who knows how useful that could be in the future with all the things that we're seeing with AI and analytics. I would say the main point I would make here is if you don't retain your data, it's no longer going to be useful for you. And so we'll talk about best practices around that. So not only to protect the business, but also ensure that you have information that helps you make better decisions in the future.
Right. Okay. Well, and that's important, Gabe. The causes of the bad outcomes that could occur if the data is not clean, so to speak. And here are some key barriers that you all at ResNav have identified as kind of throwing a monkey wrench into that whole data transfer process. The first one is poor planning. Gabe, tell us a little bit about what you all have experienced with organizations that fail to plan.
Yeah, so um, a lot of organizations are considering, I would say it right now is a big time for vendor implementations, trying to find the best solution, platform technology for their business presently, but also in the future. Oftentimes in a new implementation, the key focus is around what is the data we need to stand up and go live in our new system. That being said, oftentimes, I would say poor planning, there's misconceptions or expectations that aren't met around, well, there's a lot of data that doesn't necessarily have to come over for our new system, but it was part of our incumbent providers that's very useful for us. However, sometimes you realize that when it's too late, you're in a time compressed schedule to get your new system live, you've got a lean team. And then the other thing that we often see is sometimes there's multiple systems that the organization's been using. There's been some turnover in departments, so there could be data in places that you haven't thought about. And the worst case scenario is you lose access to that, and for all the reasons we just shared earlier, it's no longer available, and it impacts you from a compliance but also usefulness standpoint.
Right. And then we have the incompatible systems. I mean, face it, if you're switching from one major provider to another, you have these different applications. They just don't talk to each other, right, Gabe?
That's right. I mean, I would like to say a lot of times these platforms are competitors, and so they haven't built their systems necessarily to be compatible with each other. And so a word of caution is don't assume that your new provider has the capabilities to bring in the data in the way that's structured that you need from a prior system.
That's right. And then, as you already mentioned, the data can be stored across different applications, and they talk to each other to a certain extent, but that data obviously is in separate kind of files, so to speak, often fragmented and incomplete. So that status of the data being transferred is kind of not certain at the point when you really need to be determining about the transfer. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of times, even with one vendor, there may be multiple systems behind the scenes. And then we do see a lot of organizations, I think mid-market changes systems about every 3.2 years. Plus, you've got vendors that sunset modules. So long story short, there's often multiple systems at play, and it's easy to lose data in a transition.
That's right. Well, and then let's talk about some of these kind of scenarios, or should I say, point of recognition. That that we just talked about the setbacks that can occur, but let's focus on that planning part, Gabe. Tell us about how the size of an organization and other organizational attributes, and maybe who you're doing business with, how they often are factored into that lack of planning. That point of recognition, that's a big part of it, right?
That it is. I mean, tongue in cheek, but history have a problem. I think what we see in the market is at some point, organizations will realize that there's an issue with historical data being lost. Now, what I see is larger organizations, large global enterprises, typically they've got an internal department that's responsible for data. And so sunsetting systems and managing that data, a lot of times part of their RFP or process of going to a new vendor, they're factoring in things like that. So they tend to recognize it sooner. What I do see though is in the small and mid-market size businesses, typically during a implementation process is when the history we have a problem moment happens where they realize, hey, historical data can be an ambiguous term, and maybe what you thought was coming over for historical data isn't the same as the definition you got from the vendor, et cetera. And I'll say too, to my earlier point, the focus on a new transition is often what is the data that's required to go live on our new system. And so that's where your vendors, the new platform, that's where their focus will be naturally. And so they're not typically going to raise proactively as part of a new sales process, what we're going to do with the decades worth of data that you might be losing from your incumbent. And then the other thing that I would say I see in the market is we see a lot of consultants, system integrators, professional services firms being involved in the client side of the implementation, which is great. They bring their expertise, obviously can be agnostic to different systems, and there can be a lot of value there. But typically they are also focused on what's required to get the new system live. And then what we also see is that it can be cost prohibitive to have a professional services firm manage, a decade worth of data from one system to another.
All right. So these are kind of like, but now let's talk about some of these common scenarios and outcomes that you and at ResNav have witnessed. Basically, they fall into these kind of 4 case study categories, right? Why don't you go over them for us?
Sure. So I'd say the first one has become the least common, Mike. So when I started my career at ADP in 2005, maybe the do nothing was a little more prevalent, where organizations, they shut down their system and then they lost all that data. We don't see that quite as much, but it still is a category that I wanted to call out here. I'd say the second one, read only. Sometimes organizations will realize after they've sunsetted a system, hey, it turns out we have an unexpected audit that just transpired. We need access to our former provider. And so they will unarchive or get read-only access to their prior vendor to get the data that they need. Unfortunately, a lot of times the reporting capabilities are not very robust, and then there's unexpected costs associated with that. A lot of vendors will charge a monthly or quarterly cost to access their system again. I've had numerous employers who, because of an audit, they felt like they had no choice, but all of a sudden there was an unbudgeted expense that they had to pay for.
Right.
I would say, and then the third is the do-it-yourself transfer. So employers will get a point-in-time quitter file, we often call it, where they can download data. And I would say it's certainly better than the do nothing. However, one of the challenges we see is it will show you at that point in time of leaving the system all the data, what was taking place. However, if you need to go back 3 years and see what someone's time card was, what their performance review showed, what benefits they were enrolled in, you lose all that status and that dynamic history that is important from a compliance standpoint, but also it's useful in your decision making. And then the last, multi-system chaos, alluded to it earlier, but you will find that there are organizations that will try to help move all the history from one system or many systems to another. What we find, again, is these systems are competitors. They're not structured to ingest custom fields and documents and all the other details of your organization from one system to the next. And so it can be cost prohibitive, and it frankly isn't quite as useful, I think, as what organizations hope.
All right. Yeah, I was thinking that the DIY transfer, I mean, that's something that I would be inclined to do myself. And one of the things is this so similar on a personal level when you're changing devices or when you're changing laptops and you're having to migrate the data over. You kind of wonder if you're doing it right, getting it okay on the back end, if you and you're kind of doing it yourself in a lot of ways. So I can relate to some of that. And we don't know what we're going to get at that endpoint sometimes. And we realize later, oh my goodness, this never came over. It's still on my old computer. So, but now that we've covered those various ways that organizations kind of fail to optimize their data migration process, why don't you tell us kind of what the endpoint should look like? I mean, what are the attributes of success here?
Yeah, so I would say I think you want to think about data, and also what we're seeing is there's a lot of documents too that employers are tracking, whether it's I-9s, W-4s, offer letters. If you're a government contractor, you need to show applicant history and prove that you didn't discriminate against candidates, things like that. And so I would say think about at the very detailed level all the systems that you're using, all the modules that are in place, all the documents that you're tracking. And then to my earlier point, you want to be able to show point in time reporting. So if someone is disputing whether or not they should have been paid overtime, or we had a employer who a lawsuit was a former employee filed a lawsuit saying that he had been discriminated against at the employer, but they were able to go back to the point in time of there was a 360 performance review and show that the time he had given glowing reviews for the organization. Anyway, my point being the status history and what happened at specific points of time in the business helps you defend against lawsuits, compliance, audits, etc. And then I would also say, think about retention timelines for federal, state, industry record keeping requirements. And then I would say one of the biggest learnings that we've seen here at ResNav is people often don't realize how many different systems they are sunsetting. And then they also don't always think through, hey, it's painful to admit, because a new implementation can be very time consuming and you hope it's the last you ever do, but you're likely going to sunset other systems in the future. And so having a strategic way to extract, store, and then structure data so it's useful to you, I would say that's best practice.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of that. That's a component of that strategic part later on. And one of the key attributes that I've noticed in my uh, observation of what goes on here is the ability to access this data kind of independently. Um, it's an independent archive, is what we're talking about here. Can you explain a little bit more about that, Gabe?
Yeah, I would say you're often, like to my earlier point, you're going to have more than one system likely that you'll be sunsetting. So having a single database to archive data that you can search at the employee level for any point in time, uh, and store all that data for compliance audits, but also your own reporting capabilities. I think we find a lot of employers find that to be the best way of structuring their historical data to make sure that they're staying compliant and also it's useful to them.
Okay, that's great. And so let's talk about some of these post-transfer uses, because with the successful transition of the data into a place that's accessible for the team, we can see some strategic and tactical uses of the information. It just kind of shouts out at you right there. Starting with the tactical. I mean, I think the big one for me is it enhances that employee experience rather than diminish it. How many times have we seen these system transfers go across, and the employees are struggling to access through the ESS system? They have to do a separate ESS system or what have you, but it's not clear to them how they can, manage their employee requests. You have the new system, which is great for going forward, but if they want something from the past, it's not a great experience for them. Is that right, Gabe?
Yeah, that's right. And I would say, obviously HR payroll professionals know this, but you want to have a great employee experience because it's a reflection of your company brand and how you are as an employer of choice. And so common use cases we see, someone's applying for a loan, maybe their pay history needs to go back a couple years and there has been a system change, being able to respond quickly to those requests so that something that's important to that employee, you can deliver what they need. There's also some situations that are maybe unpleasant. Maybe there's a divorce or separation and there's disputes about wages. Again, being able to respond quickly as a department to those things helps, I think, with that brand and doing things that are important to that employee at that point in time.
And then for the team itself, I mean, we're looking at being able to look at some of these historical transactions and the data. You talked about the status changes and things like that as over time, and start mining that if you need to. For example, if an audit comes up, like and that's more of on a compliance bullet here. But if you look
Right.
at all these bullets, they're all kind of like, okay, something's happened. We have to react to it, and somebody wants a specific report, and maybe the new system hasn't been adopted yet to account for the older data yet. And then there's the document control issue as well. You can kind of reset your document control for this historical stuff. Who's accessing it? And business continuity, Gabe. That's a big one. I mean, I think for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what I would say, just to dovetail off of what you were just sharing, Mike, is what we find is most employers we talk to are fully aware of the compliance requirements and operating their business in the appropriate way. What can often happen, though, is, say, for instance, with I-9s, as an example, which is currently top of mind for a lot of organizations, you are complying with all of those record keeping requirements, but as part of a transition, maybe there's I-9s that are lost, and now you cannot
Mm.
respond to those audits in a way that shows that you were doing what you needed to do. So I think that's the big point to make here, is just retaining this data helps you continue to defend yourself against audits, investigations, lawsuits, et cetera. And then to your point, Mike, with the disaster response and having the data, I heard one CHRO say, it's our data. I don't want it held hostage by a prior vendor or a system that I don't have access to. Give me my data so that I can continue to run the business.
Right. And yeah, continuity. I mean, that's something that it can be part and parcel. You can access that stuff so that you can continue your business operations. Um, so let's talk about some of these strategic uses. Of course, future switches. I mean, you got to think ahead. And I think you had a great statistic about how often employers in general have at least considered changing systems over the years. And what's the figure now that you have?
The figure I've seen is it's every mid-sized companies change systems, employee-related systems, every 3.2 years. And now, some of that is driven as the organization themselves says, hey, we're growing, our current payroll platform doesn't suit our needs, so we go out to the market. But the other thing is, vendors themselves are sunsetting different modules, whether it be time and attendance or applicant tracking. And so sometimes organizations are also forced into making a change based on their vendor that they're working with.
So this kind of secure data that has been transferred over can help, be a good base for these future switches, and that's just that's a strategic thing. You really have to be thinking ahead as you grow and scale. And then, of course, you've got acquisitions and mergers and acquisition issues that you have to be thinking about, and how this data can be merged into maybe the larger set that ends up that single source of truth. Okay, that's kind of something that's becoming part of the vernacular in HCM is we want to have that single source of truth for that data. So as you're becoming more sophisticated in how you're organizing your data collection and processes and review of that data and it could be for AI efforts, it could be for the trend analysis pieces that more and more HR and payroll are being asked to do, and even leadership transitions. You want to have that secure single source of truth kind of data, and having a successful transition of the migration of your older data is really going to help provide that base for that, right, Gabe?
Absolutely. I would say, a huge use case around this is if you're doing M&A activity, if there's a PE firm that's doing portco roll-ups, we see this as a huge challenge. You're obviously going to be sunsetting systems as you bring on new companies into the parent, and so having a plan for how you retain that data and successfully integrating those new employees into the parent company. And then the single source of truth, there's a lot of use cases for why you might need to get data from multiple systems. The ACA is a great example. You need payroll, HR, benefits, time data. Often that's in different systems. And so having a single platform, similar to how the HCM suites have gone to market, we think it's the same value prop and idea for historical data, having a single place where you can access the data that came from multiple systems over various years, and even sometimes organizations, can be really useful to HR and payroll leaders.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's move on here. We need to think. This is the next stage. Is now we've seen the attributes of success and how that successful data transition can be leveraged both tactically and strategically. Let's talk about how people, maybe a little checklist here for organizations to use when they're starting to identify what's the best option for them in this application.
Yeah, I would say best case scenario, Mike, is if you're going to be transitioning to a new platform, get a very clear understanding of when you will lose access to your current system that you're sunsetting. Know your record keeping requirements for all data. It's also interesting. We find a lot of organizations don't have a clear picture, maybe because of turnover or various ways that they're record keeping of what all documents and data exists in current systems, to the degree that you can do some due diligence around what actually are we using our current system for, and then know all your point in time pay, position history. Again, often there's more than one system too, even if you're only working with one vendor that will be sunsetted as part of the transition. Knowing all that, and then the last thing I would call out is what are your export capabilities to get the data, and then trying to align all of that, getting the access to that data to coincide with when you go live so that you have a successful transition, but you don't leave any information that's critical behind.
Right. So you got this what data is moved question answered, and all that. The stuff for migration that's absolutely necessary, and then stuff that may be necessary, okay, because you don't know what's going to come up.
Right.
All right. Well, I think we're starting to wind down here. We're still identifying the proper option here. Tell us a little bit about some of the value propositions that are out there, specifically the ResNav solutions value proposition.
Yeah, I would say we have a unique approach to this challenge. The first is we're vendor agnostic. So whatever systems a client is using, we've got capabilities to extract, store, and then structure that data. And to the earlier points that we've been making, we put it in one single database with granular access down at the field level, both at the employee, document, company level, so that you always have the ability to generate the reports you need to defend yourself, and also do any kind of reporting that you would want to do that would be helpful in informing future decisions. And then because you will continue to sunset systems, we think having a single historical database that can follow your business as you grow is the best way to be proactive to make sure that you never lose data. In terms of SIs, we do work with SIs. To my earlier point, seeing them heavily involved in client-side implementations, they will focus on moving the data that's required from the system you're displacing to your new system and having a successful go live. We can complement what they're doing by making sure that the excess historical data is stored, structured, and not lost as part of that transition. And then I think, frankly, it's more than just storage. It's it's strategy. Who doesn't want to know what was happening in their business, even if it, occurred prior to them being in seat? That's always valuable. With the onset of AI, data analytics, who knows how this data could be useful to you in the future?
Right. And you spoke about kind of like, well, we saw leadership transitions. That's really kind of important for them to be able to have access to some of the history there so that they can get a better grounding of how this organization has been operating.
That's right.
Okay, well, we got some final thoughts here. We learned today that competitor systems, this is a real shout out here. Surprise, surprise, are not designed to work with each other, right? So we learned about the return on investment and risk avoidance. Um, Tell us about some of these final thoughts here, Gabe. Why don't you finish this up here?
Yeah, sure. I would just say, if anyone is in the sales world for HCM or payroll, I would say think of adding us, of being a thought leader with your new clients about, and think of adding historical data as a component of your checklist to be, a helpful consultant to the clients that you're bringing on board. This data is going to be important to them at some point, and so being proactive about ways that they can retain it so it's useful is always important. And then, for any HR payroll professionals, we're always happy to set up a time to review. If you're thinking about a system change, a lot of organizations do that in Q1, Q2 of 2026. We're happy to give you our thoughts on the best way to be proactive and make sure that you don't lose your data as part of a transition.
Well, that's fantastic there, Gabe. We've got any questions coming through here? I'm not sure how to access through this system. Well, wait a second. Now there is a question about paper. When we think about I-9s, you mentioned, Gabe, I-9 forms, a lot of times they were originally collected in paper. They didn't do the E-Verify. That's still a valid way in many, many places, but more and more people are moving to E-Verify. But you still have all this stack of I-9s, right? How do you guys handle the paper aspect of this data?
So it's actually a more common problem than you might think. We've talked to organizations where there's filing cabinets of paper that goes back decades. And I would say with technology now, there's ways that we can scan, digitize that, and then create it in a digital format as part of the transition of history. And the good news is, with paper, you have access to it. So it's maybe not as time bound as some of the other things that we've talked about today, but there are ways to make that part of the historical data management that we've discussed.
Well, that's fantastic. Did you see any other questions in there? I'm trying to see. Hold on, let me see if I can.
It looks like there's a question about how frequently organizations change payroll providers. I would say the statistic that I've seen is 3.2 years. I think on the enterprise side, large organizations, probably a little less frequent, maybe once every decade. In this SMB world, there's organizations that, God bless them, but maybe change every year based on rates and things like that.
Well, and I've seen the cycles. There's cycles where people go in-house too. So the larger organizations sometimes will go in-house, and with a lot of their payroll functions, and outsource just a few discrete pieces. So yeah, it's pretty complicated. Well, anyway, we're at the end of our presentation here. I just want to say thank you, Gabe, for joining me, and I hope we raise some awareness and I want to thank everybody that's attended, and I hope we raise some awareness and educated folks a little bit more on this really kind of crucial piece of the migration process. So thank you again, Gabe, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you all.